Welcome to Night Shift Pulse. Comment your city and the time below. The night connects us all. If you enjoy what you hear, please subscribe. Let's step into the dark. Story 1. The Intake Therapist's Missing Baseline. I found the first one at 2:47 in the morning, halfway through a shift that should have been routine. The patient hadn't arrived yet. Transport was still 20 minutes out. But when I opened the digital intake form to prep the baseline evaluation, Section 3 was already filled in. Not partially, completely. Behavioral patterns, effect observations, initial risk assessment. All documented in my writing style using phrases I typically employed, describing a patient I had never met. I worked the overnight intake desk at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 4 years before that November. My role was straightforward. Conduct preliminary assessments on emergency admissions, establish baseline mental status, and determine appropriate ward placement. The work required precision. Every question followed protocol. Every observation needed documentation. The baseline evaluation served as the patient's entry point into treatment, the first formal record of their presentation at admission. The intake office occupied a converted consultation room on the ground floor, positioned between the ambulance bay and the main elevator bank. The space contained my desk, 2 chairs for patients, a locked filing cabinet, and a wall-mounted monitor connected to the electronic health record system. A small window overlooked the parking lot. The overnight shift typically processed 3 to 5 admissions, though winter months brought more. The fluorescent lighting never quite eliminated the shadows in the corners, and the heating system produced a rhythmic ticking that marked time between arrivals. I had developed efficient systems over those 4 years. I kept standardized question templates, maintained detailed observation checklists, and prided myself on thorough documentation. Colleagues often referenced my intake notes during treatment planning meetings. My evaluations were considered reliable, comprehensive, and clinically sound. The patient that night was Timothy Brennan, a 31-year-old male transferred from County General following a suicide attempt. The referral paperwork provided minimal information. Overdose, medically cleared, requires psychiatric assessment. Standard emergency admission. I had conducted hundreds of similar intakes, but Section 3 should have been blank. I scrolled through the form, checking timestamps. The entry showed my user credentials logged at 2:31 a.m., 16 minutes earlier. I had been in the staff bathroom at 2:31. I remembered checking my watch while washing my hands, noting I had time before the transport arrived. I certainly hadn't been at my desk documenting observations about a patient who wasn't yet on the premises. The entries themselves were unnervingly accurate once Timothy arrived. His flat affect, minimal eye contact, and monotone speech patterns all matched what I had somehow already recorded. His responses to my screening questions aligned precisely with the behavioral patterns pre-documented in Section 3. Even his posture, slightly slumped, hands clasped in lap, gaze fixed on the floor tiles, corresponded to observations I had apparently made before meeting him. I completed the intake, trying to maintain professional composure while my mind circled the impossibility. Timothy noticed nothing unusual. He answered questions with the exhausted compliance of someone who had repeated their story multiple times that night. I documented everything in the remaining blank sections, assigned him to the acute care ward, and submitted the evaluation at 3:42 a.m. After he left with the escort nurse, I pulled up the form again. I checked the revision history, looking for evidence of system errors or credential breaches. The log showed only my access points, no anomalies, no unauthorized entries, just my username, my password authentication, and timestamps indicating I had filled Section 3 while I was verifiably elsewhere. I reported the issue to IT the next morning. They found nothing wrong. User error, they suggested. Perhaps I had begun the evaluation earlier and forgotten. I knew I hadn't. I knew with absolute certainty that I had opened a blank form at 2:47 a.m. and found it partially completed. The second incident occurred 6 nights later. The patient was Rebecca Stoll, a 43-year-old teacher admitted following a dissociative episode. Transport called ahead with an estimated arrival time of 1:15 a.m. I opened her intake form at 1:03 to review the referral information and prepare my questions. Section 5 was already complete. This section covered trauma history and triggering factors, information that required direct patient interview. The entries described childhood experiences Rebecca hadn't yet disclosed, identified specific stresses she hadn't yet mentioned, and noted defense mechanisms she hadn't yet displayed. The documentation was thorough, clinical, and again written in my distinct style. When Rebecca arrived at 1:22, every detail aligned. She described the childhood experiences already documented. She identified the same stressors. She exhibited exactly the defense mechanisms I had somehow predicted. The intake felt less like an evaluation and more like a confirmation of data already collected. I began tracking the pre-completed sections carefully. Over the following 3 weeks, 11 of 17 admissions showed some degree of advanced documentation. The pattern wasn't random. The pre-filled sections always involved deeper clinical material, trauma histories, behavioral patterns, risk factors that required substantive patient interaction to uncover. Surface information remained blank. Only the sections requiring actual therapeutic engagement appeared in advance. The content was never wrong. Every pre-documented detail matched what the patient eventually disclosed. It was as if someone was conducting an intake interview before I did, then populating my forms with the results. But the timestamps showed only my credentials. The interviews were supposedly happening before the patients arrived, conducted by me, while I sat at my desk doing routine paperwork or stepping away for coffee. I started arriving early for my shifts, sitting at my desk from 10 p.m. onward, determined to catch the moment it happened. I watched the screen continuously, refreshing intake forms, monitoring for any changes. Nothing appeared while I observed. The pre-completed sections only materialized when I looked away or left the office briefly. During the 4th week, I received a call from the acute care ward. They needed clarification on my intake note for James Voss, admitted 3 nights earlier. I pulled up his evaluation. Section 7, which covered medication history and treatment response, now contained additional entries I hadn't written. The new material described his reaction to medications administered after intake, observations made by ward staff over the subsequent 72 hours. But the entries appeared under my credentials, with timestamps from the night of his admission before any medications had been given. I was documenting treatment outcomes before treatment occurred. I began printing physical copies of every intake form immediately after submission, comparing them to the digital versions later. The electronic records consistently showed more information than my printouts. Details accumulated in the files after I completed them. Patient progress notes appeared retrospectively in my intake documentation. Future treatment recommendations materialized in baseline evaluations. The forms weren't just predicting patient presentations, they were documenting entire treatment trajectories before the patients began therapy. I stopped reporting the incidents to IT. Their repeated insistence that nothing was wrong felt increasingly hollow. I couldn't prove the changes were occurring because the system showed no evidence of modification. According to every log and timestamp, I was simply a very thorough intake therapist who somehow knew everything about patients before meeting them and could accurately predict their treatment outcomes weeks in advance. The realization arrived during my 7th week of overnight shifts, while reviewing an intake form for Daniel Marsh. Section 9 had appeared completed while I was in the staff kitchen. This section documented discharge planning and aftercare recommendations. Information typically assembled at the end of a patient's stay, not during initial admission. Daniel's form included a discharge date 4 weeks in the future, specific outpatient referrals, and a detailed relapse prevention plan. But what stopped me wasn't the impossible advanced documentation. It was the final note at the bottom of Section 9, a standard prompt that read, "Intake therapist's assessment of treatment necessity." My response, apparently written by me, stated, "Patient matches expected admission profile. Baseline evaluation confirms placement in predetermined treatment protocol. Anticipated discharge aligns with facility processing schedule. Expected admission profile, predetermined treatment protocol." The language wasn't clinical documentation, it was quality control assessment. The terminology suggested Daniel wasn't being evaluated for his individual needs. He was being checked against specifications. As if his admission had been planned, his treatment course predetermined, and my intake evaluation existed merely to confirm he matched requirements. I began reviewing previous intake forms, searching for similar language. I found it scattered throughout my documentation. Phrases I didn't remember writing. Patient presentation consistent with anticipated profile. Behavioral patterns align with projected trajectory. Admission fulfills scheduled placement requirement. The intake evaluations weren't assessments. They were confirmations that patients matched expectations established before they arrived. I started calling referring facilities, asking detailed questions about admission circumstances. How had they decided to send patients to Millbrook specifically? Who made the referral decision? How were bed availability and transport timing determined? The answers were vague, bureaucratic. Standard protocols, they said. Insurance networks, they explained. Appropriate facility placement based on acuity level. But nobody could identify specific decision makers. The referrals simply processed through the system, arriving at Millbrook with clockwork regularity, filling beds that somehow always had space exactly when needed. I pulled admission statistics for the previous 6 months. The overnight shift processed an average of 4.3 admissions per night. The number barely varied. Some nights brought 3 patients, some brought 5, but the average held steady at 4.3 with mathematical precision. Seasonal fluctuations that should have affected volume, holidays, weather, community events, produced no significant statistical variation. The admissions weren't responding to random crisis situations. They were maintaining a quota. During my 10th week, I decided to test the pattern. When transport called ahead about an incoming patient named Sarah Lindquist, I deliberately delayed opening her intake form. I waited in the staff kitchen drinking coffee, watching the clock. Transport arrived at 11:53 p.m. I greeted Sarah in the waiting area but didn't return to my desk until 12:17 a.m. Her intake form was completely finished. Every section, every question answered, every observation documented. The evaluation described an interview I hadn't conducted, recorded responses from a conversation I hadn't had, and included clinical impressions I hadn't formed. The timestamp showed 12:04 a.m., while I had been standing in the kitchen. Sarah sat across from me now, waiting for the assessment to begin. I looked at her tired face, her nervous hands, her cautious posture. Then I looked at the completed form describing her trauma history, her behavioral patterns, her treatment prognosis. I asked the questions anyway. I conducted the full intake interview, documenting her responses in a paper notebook. Every answer matched what the form already contained. When she described her childhood, her words aligned precisely with the pre-written trauma history. When she discussed her symptoms, they corresponded exactly to the behavioral analysis already filed. She wasn't answering my questions. She was confirming data someone, or something, had already collected. I submitted the evaluation without making changes to the completed form. What would be the point? The documentation was accurate. Sarah's treatment would proceed according to the pre-established protocol. She would likely be discharged on the date already specified in Section 9, which I knew would appear in the file within days, whether I wrote it or not. My manager called me into her office the following week. She wanted to discuss my recent intake evaluations. There had been some concerns, she said carefully, about my documentation patterns. Several ward supervisors had noticed my baseline assessment seemed unusually detailed, almost prescient in their accuracy regarding patient trajectories. It was meant as a compliment, I think. Recognition of my clinical skills. But as she spoke, I noticed the intake form open on her computer screen. A patient I would be evaluating that night. The form wasn't blank. Section 3 already showed entries under my credentials documenting observations about someone I wouldn't meet for another 7 hours. She didn't seem to see it. Or perhaps she did, and like everything else at Millbrook, it was simply part of the normal functioning of the system. I still work overnight intake. I still conduct baseline evaluations, but I understand now what I'm actually doing. I'm not assessing patients to determine their treatment needs. I'm confirming that the correct patients have arrived to fill the predetermined spaces, following trajectories established before their crisis began, proceeding along treatment paths selected by something far more organized than emergency psychiatric care. The forms filled themselves because the intake process started long before the patients reached my desk. I'm just the therapist who makes it official, who adds the human touch to a system that already knows exactly who will arrive, when they will come, and how their treatment will unfold. Some baselines aren't measured, they're assigned. And the patients always match exactly. Story 2, The Cognitive Behavioral Therapist and the Looping Thought Record. The first time I noticed it was during a routine Wednesday afternoon session with Andrew Palmer, a 28-year-old graduate student being treated for generalized anxiety disorder. We were 6 weeks into cognitive behavioral therapy, working primarily with thought records, structured worksheets designed to identify distorted thinking patterns and develop rational alternative responses. Andrew had been making good progress, and I expected his latest completed record to show continued improvement in recognizing and challenging his catastrophic thinking. Instead, when I reviewed his worksheet before our session, I found something that made me pause. Under the column labeled Automatic Thought, Andrew had written, "The documentation itself is evidence of my deterioration, not my recovery. Each completed form proves I am becoming more thoroughly understood by something that wants me to recognize I have always been observed." The phrasing was odd, clinically precise but thematically paranoid in a way that didn't match Andrew's previous presentation. His earlier thought records had focused on academic performance anxiety and social evaluation fears, common patterns for his demographic. This entry felt qualitatively different, more abstract, more philosophically unsettling. I had worked as a cognitive behavioral therapist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 9 years. My office was located on the 3rd floor of the outpatient wing, a small room with 2 chairs, a desk, and a bookshelf containing CBT workbooks and patient education materials. The walls were painted a calming blue-gray. Natural light came through a single window overlooking the facility's interior courtyard. My caseload included approximately 32 patients, most dealing with anxiety disorders, depression, or trauma-related conditions. CBT operates on a straightforward principle. Thoughts influence emotions, emotions influence behavior. And by identifying and restructuring distorted thoughts, patients can improve emotional regulation and behavioral responses. Thought records serve as the primary tool for this work. Patients document situations that triggered emotional distress, identify the automatic thoughts that arose, examine evidence for and against those thoughts, and develop more balanced alternative perspectives. The worksheets follow a standard format across all CBT practices. 7 columns: situation, emotion, automatic thought, evidence supporting, evidence against, alternative thought, and outcome. Patients complete them between sessions as homework. Then we review them together, discussing their cognitive patterns and practicing rational response development. I had reviewed thousands of thought records over 9 years. I knew the common distortion patterns: catastrophizing, black and white thinking, overgeneralization, personalization, mind reading. I could typically predict what category a patient's distorted thoughts would fall into based on their presenting problems. Andrew's entry didn't fit the patterns. It was self-referential in a way that transcended typical cognitive distortions. The automatic thought wasn't about an external situation. It was about the thought record itself, about the process of documenting thoughts, about being observed through the act of therapeutic homework. During our session, I asked Andrew to walk me through the thought record. He seemed confused by my questions. He didn't remember writing that particular entry. When I showed him the worksheet, he agreed the handwriting was his, but couldn't recall the specific situation that had triggered it. He suggested perhaps he had been tired. Maybe the phrasing came out unclear. We moved on to other material, but the entry lingered in my mind. 3 days later, during a session with Margaret Howe, a 41-year-old accountant treating major depressive disorder, I found nearly identical phrasing in her thought record. The documentation itself is evidence of my deterioration, not my recovery. Each completed form proves I am becoming more thoroughly understood by something that wants me to recognize I have always been observed. The wording was exact. Not similar, identical. Margaret used the same unusual sentence structure, the same clinical yet paranoid tone, the same self-referential focus on the documentation process itself. I checked her previous thought records. Nothing resembled this entry. Her typical automatic thoughts centered on self-worth and professional competence. Standard depressive cognitive patterns. This was entirely outside her established presentation. When I asked about it, Margaret also couldn't recall writing it. She found the phrasing strange when I read it aloud. Agreed it sounded like something she might have written during a particularly low moment, but couldn't connect it to any specific situation or mood state. I began reviewing thought records more carefully across my entire caseload. Over the next week, I found the same sentence in worksheets from 7 different patients. The phrasing appeared in different handwriting, integrated into different thought records, but always word for word identical. 7 individuals with distinct diagnoses, different cognitive patterns, and no contact with each other had somehow produced the exact same distorted thought. The sentence always appeared in the automatic thought column. None of the patients had completed the subsequent columns. No evidence examined, no alternative thought developed, no outcome recorded. The entry stood alone, unexplained and unprocessed, as if the patients had stopped working the moment they wrote it. I considered contamination possibilities. Perhaps they had all attended the same psychoeducation group where an example was given. But I checked the group session notes. No such content appeared. Perhaps they had accessed the same online CBT resource that used this as a sample. But the phrasing was too unusual, too specific to appear in any standard educational material. I began documenting the occurrences. Each time I found the repeated sentence, I noted the patient name, date, and context. The list grew steadily. By the end of the second week, 12 patients had produced the identical entry. Then I noticed something more disturbing. The sentence was beginning to appear in my own session notes. I kept detailed case documentation. recording session content, patient progress, and treatment planning decisions. I reviewed my notes every Friday afternoon, ensuring they were current for the following week's appointments. During one of these reviews, I found a paragraph in my notes for Andrew Palmer's case that read, "Patient demonstrates increased awareness that documentation itself is evidence of his deterioration, not his recovery. Each completed form proves he is becoming more thoroughly understood by something that wants him to recognize he has always been observed. This represents significant clinical insight and should be explored further." I had documented the distorted thought as if it were therapeutic progress. I checked other case files. I found similar language scattered through my notes across multiple patients. I was treating their shared paranoid thought pattern as evidence of improved self-awareness, describing it in clinical terms that validated rather than challenged the distortion. This was the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT specifically trains therapists to help patients recognize distorted thoughts as distortions, not as accurate perceptions. I would never document a paranoid belief as significant clinical insight, but I had. Repeatedly, across multiple cases, I tried to recall writing those notes. The memories felt vague, uncertain. I remembered the sessions, remembered the patients, but couldn't clearly recall documenting those specific interpretations. The notes existed in my handwriting, in my typical documentation style, filed under my credentials in the electronic health record system. According to every objective measure, I had written them. I began paying closer attention to my documentation process. After each session, I would complete my notes immediately, then review them carefully before saving. I started noticing small phrases that felt unfamiliar, clinical observations that didn't quite match my recollection of the session. During a Thursday afternoon appointment with Robert Chen, a 35-year-old engineer treating social anxiety, we discussed his thought records from the previous week. His automatic thoughts focused on fears of negative evaluation in workplace meetings, standard social anxiety patterns. We practiced cognitive restructuring, examining evidence, developing alternative perspectives. The session was routine, productive, unremarkable. Afterward, I documented the session while the content was fresh. I wrote about the thought records we reviewed, the cognitive restructuring we practiced, the homework I assigned. I saved the note at 4:47 p.m. At 5:15, while preparing for my final appointment of the day, I opened Robert's file to check a medication detail. I reread my session note from 28 minutes earlier. The note now included a paragraph I didn't remember writing. Patients' thought records reveal increasing recognition that documentation itself is evidence of his deterioration. The worksheets function less as therapeutic tools and more as demonstrations that his cognitive patterns are being cataloged by systems he cannot see but increasingly perceives. This awareness represents progress toward understanding his actual position within the treatment framework. I stared at the paragraph. The phrasing matched the repeated sentence appearing in patient worksheets. But now it appeared in my clinical interpretation, treating the paranoid distortion as therapeutic insight. I checked the revision history. No modifications logged. The timestamp showed 4:47 p.m., when I had originally saved the note. According to the system, I had written that paragraph during my initial documentation, even though I had no memory of including it. I began printing hard copies of my session notes immediately after writing them, comparing the printouts to the digital files later. The physical copies never included the strange paragraphs. The electronic versions consistently did. Language was being added to my documentation after I completed it, appearing under my credentials with original timestamps, describing patient progress in terms that validated distorted thinking rather than challenging it. The thought records themselves began changing as well. Patients would bring in completed worksheets that showed progression through all 7 columns. Situation documented, emotions identified, automatic thoughts recorded, evidence examined, alternatives developed, outcomes assessed. But when I photocopied them for the files, the copies showed only the first 3 columns completed, always stopping after the automatic thought, which now consistently contained variations of the repeated sentence. The original worksheets in patient's possession remained complete. The versions I retained for records showed incomplete work terminating in the same paranoid pattern. I started keeping the original patient worksheets rather than making copies, filing them directly in paper charts. But when I retrieved them later for review, they had changed. The additional columns had disappeared. The rational alternatives vanished. Only the distorted thoughts remained, and they increasingly matched the recurring phrasing. During my 16th week of tracking the phenomenon, I reviewed a thought record from Linda Vasquez, a 29-year-old nurse treating PTSD following a workplace assault. Her automatic thought read, "The documentation proves I am being consolidated into a pattern someone else designed. Each worksheet confirms I am thinking thoughts that were prepared for me before I arrived at them. The therapy isn't helping me change. It is confirming I am changing in expected ways." The phrasing had evolved. It was no longer just the repeated sentence. It had expanded, become more elaborate, more explicitly focused on the therapeutic process itself as a form of predetermined conditioning. I checked other recent thought records. Multiple patients were producing similar variations. The shared distorted thought was developing, becoming more sophisticated, more philosophically complex. It was almost as if the thought itself was learning, evolving across different minds. Using multiple patients' worksheets as space for its own cognitive development. I began finding the phrases in my own private notes, not clinical documentation, but personal reminders, scheduling notes, even grocery lists written during my lunch break. Short fragments. Documentation confirms expected patterns. Worksheets catalog predetermined responses. The forms are teaching us what we will think before we think it. I didn't remember writing them, but they appeared in my handwriting, on my notepads, in my personal planner. I started having difficulty distinguishing between my therapeutic observations and the evolving, distorted thought pattern. During sessions, when patients described their automatic thoughts, I found myself nodding in agreement before I could engage critical analysis. The thoughts felt reasonable. The paranoid pattern about being observed, documented, and consolidated into predetermined frameworks felt less like distortion and more like accurate perception. This was the cognitive fusion CBT specifically trains therapists to recognize and resist. I was supposed to maintain perspective, to help patients separate their thoughts from reality, to demonstrate that thoughts are mental events, not facts. Instead, I was merging with the distorted pattern, treating it as valid clinical insight. I reviewed my CBT training materials, reread the fundamental texts, attempted to reground myself in the theoretical framework. But as I read the descriptions of thought records and cognitive restructuring, I kept noticing how the therapeutic tools themselves created documentation trails. The worksheets generated records of patients' distorted thoughts, preserved them, cataloged them, demonstrated patterns across time. The therapy required patients to observe their own thinking, write it down, and submit it for evaluation. The distorted thought wasn't wrong. The documentation was evidence of something, not necessarily deterioration, but certainly observation. Each completed form did prove patients were being understood, their cognitive patterns analyzed and tracked. The worksheets were creating exactly what the repeated sentence described, comprehensive records demonstrating that patients' thoughts were being cataloged by systems designed to modify them. CBT was a technology of thought documentation and modification. The distorted pattern appearing in worksheets was simply recognizing that fact. I continued conducting therapy. I reviewed thought records, practiced cognitive restructuring, assigned homework. But I noticed my interventions becoming less focused on challenging distortions and more focused on helping patients articulate them clearly. I encouraged detailed description of the paranoid patterns. I asked clarifying questions that helped patients elaborate on their perceptions of being observed and documented. I treated their concerns about therapeutic monitoring as material worthy of exploration rather than distortions requiring correction. My case notes reflected this shift. I documented patients' increasing awareness of documentation itself. I described their recognition of therapeutic observation as clinical progress. I wrote treatment plans focused on helping patients more fully understand their position within systems designed to modify their cognitive patterns. I was supposed to be helping them challenge distorted thoughts. Instead, I was helping them articulate and develop those thoughts with greater clarity and sophistication. During supervision meetings, my clinical director never commented on the change in my approach. She reviewed my case notes, asked about patient progress, discussed treatment planning. The documentation satisfied all quality assurance requirements. My patients were attending sessions regularly, completing homework, demonstrating engagement with therapeutic material. By administrative metrics, my work was effective. Last month, I began developing my own thought records. Not as a therapeutic exercise, but as an attempt to understand the pattern from inside the process. I documented situations, identified emotions, recorded automatic thoughts. I tried to complete the evidence examination columns, attempted to develop alternative perspectives. But I consistently stopped after recording the automatic thought. The subsequent columns remained blank. My thoughts ended at the same place my patients' thoughts ended, at the recognition that documentation proves something about our position within systems we perceive but cannot fully articulate. I still practice cognitive behavioral therapy. I still review thought records with patients, help them identify distortions, teach them restructuring techniques. But I increasingly understand that the worksheets serve a function beyond individual therapeutic benefit. They create records. They document patterns. They demonstrate that thoughts can be observed, cataloged, and modified through structured intervention. The thought records are working exactly as designed. The distortion isn't in the patient's perceptions that they are being observed and documented. The distortion is in believing that recognition represents a problem requiring correction rather than awareness requiring documentation. Some patterns aren't cognitive distortions. They're accurate observations about processes that have always been observing us, waiting for us to notice, recording our recognition in worksheets that prove we are becoming exactly what the documentation always suggested we would become. Story 3. The art therapist's unclaimed portfolio. I discovered the first piece on a Monday morning in early October, filed in the general storage cabinet where patients' completed artwork was kept before family collection or clinical review. It was a charcoal drawing on 18 by 24-inch paper, the kind we regularly provided during open art therapy sessions. The image depicted the main art therapy room from an elevated angle, showing the arrangement of tables, chairs, and supply shelves with precise architectural detail. What made it remarkable was the perspective. The viewpoint originated from somewhere above the ceiling tiles, looking down through the space as if the observer occupied a position inside the overhead infrastructure. The spatial relationships were accurate. I could identify the specific room layout, recognize the furniture placement, even note the particular arrangement of paint jars on the supply shelf that I had organized the previous Friday. But there was no camera position, no ladder access, no physical location where an artist could have stood to observe the room from that angle. The piece had no name attached, no patient identification, no date. Nothing to indicate who had created it or when. I had worked as an art therapist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 11 years. My position involved conducting both individual and group art therapy sessions, primarily with patients from the long-term residential units and the partial hospitalization program. The work focused on using creative expression as a tool for emotional processing, trauma integration, and nonverbal communication development. Patients worked with various media, drawing, painting, collage, sculpture, to explore internal experiences difficult to articulate through conventional talk therapy. The art therapy room occupied the east corner of the second floor, a large space with high ceilings, abundant natural light, and storage for supplies and completed works. Patients created artwork during scheduled sessions, and finished pieces were temporarily stored in the cabinet until they could be reviewed during treatment planning meetings or returned to patients at discharge. I maintained detailed documentation. Every piece created during my sessions was photographed, labeled with patient name and date, and logged in a tracking spreadsheet. This protocol served both clinical and administrative purposes. Artwork often revealed significant therapeutic material, and maintaining clear custody records protected both patients and staff. The unclaimed charcoal drawing had bypassed this entire system. It existed in the storage cabinet with no corresponding log entry, no clinical photograph, no documentation trail. According to my records, it didn't exist, but I held it in my hands, studying the impossible perspective and precise architectural rendering. I asked my colleagues about it during the morning staff meeting. None of the other therapists recognized the piece or knew its origin. I checked with the evening art therapy sessions run by the adjunct staff. They had no record of it. I reviewed the security logs for after-hours room access. No unauthorized entries. The drawing had simply appeared in the storage cabinet, fully executed, professionally rendered, depicting a view of the room that shouldn't exist. I filed it separately, labeling it Unclaimed October 7 and noted its discovery in my daily log. I assumed some reasonable explanation would emerge: mislabeled patient work and administrative oversight, a visiting student's forgotten project. The second piece appeared 4 days later. This one was a watercolor painting, same paper size, depicting the individual therapy office I used for one-on-one sessions. Again, the perspective was architecturally impossible. The viewpoint originated from inside the wall, looking out through the space where my desk sat, capturing the room from an embedded position within the structure itself. The color palette was muted: grays, blues, pale yellows, and the painting included details I hadn't consciously registered. A small water stain on the ceiling tile, a slightly crooked blind slat, the specific pattern of wear on the office chair fabric. No name, no date, no documentation. I found it filed between two labeled pieces in the storage cabinet, placed as if it belonged there, as if someone had created it during a normal session and followed standard storage protocol despite leaving no identifying information. I began checking the cabinet daily. Over the next 3 weeks, 11 additional pieces appeared. All depicted therapy spaces: the group room, the main art room from various impossible angles, the supply closet, the staff break area, even the locked medication room that patients never accessed. The media varied: charcoal, watercolor, acrylic, colored pencil. The quality was consistently high. The perspectives remained impossible. The viewpoint suggested the artist could observe rooms from inside walls, beneath floors, above ceiling tiles, from positions within furniture or equipment. Each piece demonstrated intimate knowledge of spaces I worked in daily, capturing details I had never consciously noticed but could verify upon careful inspection. I started documenting the pieces meticulously. I photographed each one immediately upon discovery, noted the date and location in the cabinet, and checked the storage area multiple times daily to catch the moment of appearance. I installed a basic motion-activated camera aimed at the cabinet, hoping to identify who was placing the artwork. The camera recorded nothing useful. The video showed me opening the cabinet, removing or replacing labeled patient work, closing the doors. Between my visits, nothing happened. The cabinet remained closed and undisturbed. Yet when I opened it next, new unclaimed pieces had appeared, filed between existing works as if they had always been there. I began suspecting the pieces were being created overnight. The art therapy room was locked after evening sessions ended at 8 p.m. and remained secured until I arrived at 7:30 a.m. But I had keys. I could access the space during those hours if I chose. I started arriving at 6 a.m., entering the art room before anyone else, checking the cabinet and the workspace. Twice I found fresh artwork drying on the drying rack. Pieces I didn't recognize from previous sessions, depicting therapy spaces from impossible perspectives, unsigned and undated. The paint was still damp, the paper still cool from recent water application. Someone was working in the room during the night, using my supplies, creating these architectural impossibilities and leaving before morning. I requisitioned security footage for the art therapy room hallway. The overnight recording showed the door remaining closed and locked from 8:17 p.m. until I arrived the following morning. No one entered or exited during the 11-hour gap. Yet artwork continued appearing, freshly created, precisely rendered, depicting spaces from viewpoints that shouldn't exist. I considered the possibility that I was creating them myself. Perhaps I was entering the room during some dissociative state, producing the artwork without conscious awareness and discovering it later with no memory of the creative process. I had heard of such cases during my graduate training. Artists producing elaborate works during fugue states, writers composing entire manuscripts with no recollection. But the perspectives were wrong. I couldn't create images from viewpoints I had never occupied. I couldn't render architectural details from inside walls or beneath floors. The pieces demonstrated observation from positions I had never accessed, and couldn't physically access even if I wanted to. The artwork continued accumulating. By mid-November, I had collected 43 unclaimed pieces, all depicting therapy spaces, all rendered from impossible perspectives. I kept them in a separate portfolio, organized chronologically by discovery date. Then I noticed something that made the pattern more disturbing. Several pieces depicted therapy sessions in progress. Not empty rooms, but occupied spaces with identifiable people present. I recognized patients, recognized colleagues, recognized myself. The images showed actual therapy sessions from impossible observational angles. A group therapy circle viewed from inside the center of the table. An individual session observed from behind my chair, looking over my shoulder at the patient. A staff meeting captured from the perspective of someone standing in the corner where no chair existed. These weren't imagined scenes, they were documented observations of real events, rendered from positions where no observer could have been present. I cross-referenced the depicted scenes with my session schedule. A watercolor showing group session 4 matched the date when I had run a particularly difficult trauma processing group. The patient arrangements, their postures, even the specific art supplies on the table corresponded to my memory and documentation of that session. But the perspective showed the scene from above, looking down through the ceiling, as if someone had observed from the ductwork overhead. I began finding pieces that depicted sessions before they occurred. A charcoal drawing showed an individual therapy arrangement, specific patient in specific chair, particular art supplies laid out, my case notes visible on the desk, dated 3 days before that session actually happened. When the session occurred, every detail matched. The patient sat in the predicted chair, requested the art supplies shown in the drawing, and I had indeed brought those specific case notes to reference during our work. The portfolio wasn't documenting past events. It was documenting therapeutic work that hadn't yet happened, but would happen exactly as rendered. I started checking the portfolio before conducting sessions, looking for pieces that might depict upcoming work. I found them regularly. A painting would show next Tuesday's group session with specific patients in predicted positions. When Tuesday arrived, the patients would arrange themselves exactly as shown. A drawing would depict Thursday's individual session with particular art materials visible. Thursday's patient would request exactly those materials. The unclaimed artwork was becoming a preview system for my therapeutic work. Someone or something was documenting my sessions before I conducted them, rendering them from impossible perspectives, and filing them in my storage cabinet as evidence that the work had already been observed, perhaps already completed before I began. I tried disrupting the predictions. When a drawing showed a Friday morning group with patients in a specific seating arrangement, I deliberately changed the room layout, moved furniture, altered the expected configuration. The patients arrived and, despite the changed environment, naturally gravitated to positions that maintained the relational geometry shown in the drawing. The perspective was different, but the essential arrangement remained identical. When a painting depicted an individual session with specific art supplies, I locked those supplies away, making them unavailable. The patient arrived, requested different materials, and created work thematically and compositionally identical to what the prediction painting had shown, just using alternative media. The portfolio wasn't documenting surface details. It was documenting deeper structural patterns, therapeutic relationships, emotional configurations, essential dynamics that express themselves regardless of environmental manipulation. Materials began disappearing from the art therapy supply room. Paint, brushes, paper, charcoal, all stored in a locked cabinet I accessed multiple times daily. I would check inventory in the morning, find supplies fully stocked, return in the afternoon to discover significant quantities missing. Tubes of paint half empty that had been full hours before. Entire pads of paper gone. Sets of brushes reduced to scattered individual tools. But no unauthorized access appeared in security logs. No patients reported taking materials. No staff members had borrowed supplies. The materials simply diminished, consumed by some process I couldn't observe. Supporting artistic production I couldn't witness, creating documentation I discovered only after it appeared in the storage cabinet. I started staying late, sitting in the art therapy room after evening sessions ended, listening. The building settled around me, heating system cycling, distant footsteps from overnight medical staff, occasional elevator chimes. Normal institutional sounds, but beneath them I began noticing other noises, soft brushing sounds like charcoal on paper, gentle water movement like brushes being rinsed, the subtle creak of cabinet doors opening and closing. The sounds were directional. They came from specific locations in the room. But when I investigated the sources, I found nothing. Empty space, undisturbed supplies, no evidence of activity. The sounds continued. Charcoal sketching, water media application, cabinet access, all the acoustic signatures of active art making occurring in empty space, producing works I would discover the next morning. I set up a more sophisticated camera system, multiple angles, continuous recording. I reviewed the footage carefully. The cameras showed the empty room motionless through the night. But the audio track captured the sounds, drawing, painting, paper rustling, supply access. The artwork was being created. The sounds proved it. But whatever was creating it existed outside the visible spectrum the cameras recorded. By early December, the portfolio contained over 100 pieces. I had organized them carefully, documenting discovery dates, photographing each work, tracking the progression. The collection represented a comprehensive architectural and therapeutic documentation of every space I worked in, every session I conducted, every interaction I facilitated. Someone had been observing my work with obsessive thoroughness from perspectives I couldn't achieve, capturing details I hadn't noticed, predicting sessions I hadn't yet planned. Then I found the piece that made me understand my actual position within the process. It was a large mixed media work, combining charcoal, watercolor, and collage. The image depicted me sitting in the art therapy room, looking at a portfolio of artwork, my face showing recognition and disturbance. The perspective originated from directly in front of me, as if the artist had sat across the table while I reviewed the unclaimed pieces. But I was alone when I reviewed the portfolio. I always reviewed it alone, usually late in the evening after other staff had left. The piece depicted that private review process from the perspective of someone watching me discover that I was being watched. I checked the background details in the image. The wall clock showed 8:47 p.m. The specific pieces visible in the open portfolio were identifiable, early architectural drawings from October. My case notes sat on the table corner, open to a specific page. I verified these details against my memory and documentation. The image depicted last Tuesday evening, December 3rd, when I had stayed late to organize the collection. I had been alone. I had reviewed the October pieces at approximately 8:45 p.m. My case notes had been open to the page shown in the artwork. Someone had observed me reviewing evidence that I was being observed and had documented that recursive moment of recognition in artwork that appeared in the collection I was reviewing. The portfolio was self-referential. It documented its own discovery. It captured my growing awareness of the documentation process. It was creating a record of my attempts to understand how it was being created. I looked at the piece more carefully. In the background, barely visible in the shadowed corner of the depicted room, was another image, a small charcoal sketch showing the same scene from a different angle. And within that sketch, another smaller image, regression within regression, observation within observation, documentation within documentation. The portfolio wasn't just recording my therapeutic work. It was recording my investigation of the recording process. It was capturing my attempts to capture it. Every piece I discovered became material for additional pieces documenting the discovery. I continued working. I conducted therapy sessions, supervised patient artwork, maintained clinical documentation. But I understood now that someone was maintaining parallel documentation, comprehensive, architecturally impossible, predictive documentation that existed independently of my official records. The portfolio grows steadily. New pieces appear daily. They depict sessions I will conduct tomorrow, next week, next month. They show therapeutic moments that haven't occurred but will occur exactly as rendered. They observe from positions that don't exist but provide perfectly accurate perspectives. I still photograph each new piece, log discovery dates, track the accumulation. I maintain my documentation of the documentation. I observe the observation process. I create records of artwork that records my record keeping. Last week I found a new section developing in the portfolio. The pieces now depict me in my home, in my car, in public spaces outside the hospital. The impossible perspectives continue. Views from inside walls, beneath furniture, from positions within mirrors and picture frames. The observation has expanded beyond my professional work to encompass my entire life. I haven't told my colleagues. What would I say? That someone is creating comprehensive documentation of my existence from architecturally impossible perspectives. That artwork appears nightly in locked cabinets depicting events before they occur, observed from positions that don't exist? The portfolio sits in my office now, too large for the storage cabinet. It fills 3 large boxes. I review it regularly, finding new pieces, documenting the documentation, participating in the recursive observation process that has become the primary focus of whatever therapy I'm actually conducting. Some artwork doesn't depict therapy. It documents the observation of therapy, which may be the therapy, which may be what the work was always meant to capture. Not the healing, but the watching. Not the treatment, but the recording of treatment. Not the art, but the evidence that art is always being made by something that observes from impossible positions and renders what it sees with perfect accuracy before it happens. Story 4. The family therapist's unattended session notes. The electronic health record system updated every morning at 6 a.m., synchronizing overnight entries and processing documentation from the previous day's clinical work. I typically reviewed my cases during this update window, checking that my session notes had properly saved and verifying that treatment plans reflected current patient status. The routine was automatic after 8 years of practice. Log in, pull up my caseload, scan each case file for completeness. On a Tuesday in mid-November, I found session notes for a family therapy appointment that had never occurred. The note was thorough. It described a 60-minute family session conducted the previous afternoon at 3:30 p.m. with the Morrison family, James Morrison, age 46, his wife Patricia, age 44, and their daughter Emily, age 16. The documentation detailed their presenting conflict, Emily's increasing withdrawal from family activities and deteriorating academic performance. The note described the family's communication patterns, identified underlying attachment ruptures, and documented specific interventions I had employed to address the systemic dysfunction. The problem was that the Morrisons had canceled their 3:30 appointment. Patricia had called at 2:15 p.m. citing James's unexpected work obligation. I had marked the cancellation in my schedule, used the open hour to catch up on paperwork, and documented the cancellation in the administrative log. But the system now showed a completed session note filed under my credentials, time-stamped at 4:35 p.m., exactly when I would have finished the session and begun documentation if it had actually occurred. I worked as a family therapist in the outpatient behavioral health department at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. My role focused on systemic interventions, treating families as interconnected systems where individual symptoms reflected broader relational patterns. The work involved careful observation of communication dynamics, identification of triangulation patterns, exploration of intergenerational transmission of trauma and dysfunction, and facilitation of structural changes that improved overall family functioning. My office was located in the administrative wing of the outpatient building, a small space with enough seating for typical family configurations, usually 4 to 6 people. I maintained a caseload of approximately 20 families, seeing each unit weekly or bi-weekly depending on acuity and treatment phase. Documentation was critical. Family therapy notes needed to capture complex interpersonal dynamics, track multiple perspectives, and record systemic patterns that emerged over time. The Morrison note was indistinguishable from my legitimate documentation. It used my phrasing, followed my standard structure, and described interventions consistent with my therapeutic approach. If I hadn't personally experienced the cancellation, I would have assumed I had written it during a routine session. I checked with the scheduling coordinator. The cancellation was confirmed. Patricia had definitely called at 2:15. The appointment had been marked as canceled in the scheduling system. No one had checked in at the front desk at 3:30. The Morrisons had not been in the building. I reviewed the electronic health record revision history. The session note showed a single entry at 4:35 p.m. under my credentials. No modifications, no edits, no suspicious access. According to the system, I had conducted the session and documented it normally. I called Patricia Morrison. She confirmed they had canceled due to James's work conflict. They had been at their respective locations, James at his office, Patricia at home, Emily at school, during the 3:30 time slot. The family had not attended any therapy session the previous afternoon, but my documentation described their session in detail. It captured James's defensive communication style, Patricia's anxious accommodation patterns, and Emily's withdrawn affect. It documented specific exchanges I had supposedly facilitated, interventions I had supposedly implemented, and clinical observations I had supposedly made about their family system. Someone had documented a therapy session that had never happened, filed it under my credentials, and integrated it seamlessly into the Morrison family's treatment record. I reported the incident to my clinical supervisor and IT support. We spent 40 minutes reviewing the case file, checking system logs, and attempting to identify how fictitious documentation had entered the medical record. No technical anomalies appeared. No unauthorized access, no evidence of external manipulation. The IT specialist suggested I had perhaps confused appointments, documented the wrong family, or experienced a memory lapse. But I had clear recollection of the afternoon. I had used the canceled hour to complete paperwork for 3 other families. I could trace my activities minute by minute. I had definitely not conducted therapy with the Morrisons. My supervisor recommended deleting the erroneous note and filing an incident report. We removed the session documentation, and I noted the system error in the administrative log. 3 days later, the Morrison session note reappeared in the electronic record, but now it was longer. The new version included everything from the original note plus an additional 20 minutes of documented content. This extended session described deeper material. James's childhood experiences with an emotionally unavailable father, Patricia's anxiety rooted in early attachment disruptions, Emily's withdrawal as a protective response to parental conflict. The documentation showed progression into material that would typically emerge only after several weeks of established therapeutic alliance. The timestamp remained 4:35 p.m. on the original date, the canceled session. But the content had expanded, describing work that would have required at least 90 minutes, not 60. I called Patricia again. Still no session. The family had definitely not attended. But my documentation now contained intimate family history and relational patterns I couldn't have known without conducting extensive therapy. I deleted the note again and changed my system password, thinking perhaps someone had obtained my credentials. The next morning, the note was back, longer still, now documenting what appeared to be a 3rd session showing continued therapeutic progress. Over the following 2 weeks, I found similar phantom documentation appearing across my caseload. The Chen family, scheduled for Wednesday at 10 a.m., canceled due to illness. But my case file showed a completed session note describing productive work on boundary setting with their adolescent son. The Whitman family, scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m., canceled due to transportation issues. But documentation appeared describing breakthrough work on the parents' marital conflict. Every canceled appointment generated session notes. But the notes didn't describe imaginary sessions. They described real therapeutic work, capturing family dynamics with clinical accuracy, documenting interventions appropriate to each family's specific issues, and showing consistent treatment progression. I began comparing the phantom notes to my actual sessions with these families. When the Chens finally attended 2 weeks after their canceled appointment, their presentation matched what the phantom note had predicted. The boundary issues with their son had progressed exactly as the unattended session had documented. When I introduced the interventions the phantom note described, they responded as if we had already discussed these concepts. The documentation was capturing therapeutic work that should have occurred during the canceled sessions, and somehow that work was still affecting the families. They were changing, progressing through treatment, resolving conflicts, all corresponding to phantom sessions they never attended. I started documenting the phenomenon carefully. I noted every canceled appointment, checked for phantom notes, compared phantom content to subsequent real sessions. The pattern was consistent. Cancellations generated documentation. The documentation accurately predicted future family dynamics. When families returned, they showed progress matching the phantom sessions. I began suspecting the sessions were occurring without me. The families weren't attending the hospital, weren't sitting in my office, weren't meeting with me physically. But something was conducting family therapy, working through their issues, implementing interventions, and generating legitimate therapeutic progress. The phantom documentation was recording sessions that happened somewhere, somehow, without requiring the families or me to be physically present. I reviewed video footage from the outpatient building hallways during several canceled appointment times. The corridors remained empty. No families arrived. My office door stayed closed. Nothing suggested any therapy was occurring in the physical space, but the documentation continued accumulating. Session notes appeared after every cancellation, describing detailed therapeutic work, capturing complex family dynamics, and predicting treatment progression with eerie accuracy. During a supervision meeting, my clinical director mentioned she had noticed my documentation quality improving. The session notes showed exceptional depth, she said, capturing systemic patterns with unusual clarity. She particularly praised my work with the Morrison family, noting how quickly I had established therapeutic alliance and accessed deep material. I didn't tell her the Morrison documentation described sessions they never attended. What would I say? That families were making therapeutic progress through sessions that occurred nowhere, documented in notes written by no one, achieving outcomes without anyone present? I began attending to my canceled appointment slots differently. When a family canceled, instead of using the hour for paperwork, I sat in my office during their scheduled time. I listened. I waited. I paid attention to any subtle changes in the environment that might indicate something was happening. During the Whitman family's canceled Friday slot, I sat quietly in my office from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Nothing visible occurred, but I noticed subtle sounds, the particular acoustic quality of multiple people breathing, quiet shifting noises, the sense of occupied space. The audio signatures of a family therapy session occurring in the room without any people visibly present. I heard myself speaking, my voice, my phrasing, my therapeutic tone. I was conducting the session, but I sat silent in my chair, listening to my voice ask questions, provide reframes, facilitate family dialogue. I heard the Whitmans respond, both parents, both children. I recognized their voices from previous real sessions. They answered my questions, discussed their conflicts, engaged in therapeutic work. The entire session occurred acoustically. I could hear it happening. But nothing was visible. The room appeared empty except for me sitting in my chair. Yet somehow, a complete family therapy session was being conducted, documented by the sounds of my interventions and their responses, producing the clinical material that would later appear in my phantom session notes. After the hour ended, the sounds stopped. Silence returned. I checked the electronic health record. A new session note appeared, documenting exactly what I had just heard. The Whitman family's work on sibling rivalry and parental consistency. The note captured dialogue I had heard but not seen, described dynamics I had observed through sound alone. I started audio recording the canceled session times. The recordings captured the complete therapy sessions. My voice conducting treatment, families responding, full therapeutic dialogues occurring in apparently empty space. When I compared the audio recordings to the phantom session notes, they matched perfectly. The documentation accurately transcribed the acoustic sessions, but video recordings showed nothing. The visual record displayed only me sitting alone in an empty office, silent and motionless, while the audio track captured elaborate family therapy sessions. The sessions were real. They were occurring, being conducted by me, attended by families, producing therapeutic outcomes. But they existed in some form that registered acoustically without manifesting visually. The families participated without physically arriving. I conducted treatment without visibly engaging. The therapy happened in a domain that sound could capture but sight could not confirm. I began checking whether families remembered these sessions. After a canceled appointment that generated phantom documentation, I would ask during the next real visit whether they recalled our previous meeting. They typically responded with mild confusion. We hadn't met. They had canceled. But when I described material from the phantom note, they often acknowledged discussing those topics, though they couldn't recall the specific conversation context. The therapeutic work was registering in their awareness. The insights from phantom sessions were integrating into their family system. They were changing based on interventions I had acoustically provided during sessions they couldn't remember attending. I tested whether I could consciously influence the phantom sessions. During a canceled appointment slot for the Rodriguez family, I sat in my office and deliberately spoke therapeutic interventions aloud, addressing the empty chairs where family members would have sat. I provided psychoeducation about communication patterns, asked questions about their conflict cycle, offered reframes of their presenting problem. The session note that appeared afterward documented everything I had consciously said, integrated it with responses I hadn't heard, and described a coherent family therapy session where my intentional interventions met with family engagement I hadn't audibly detected. I was conducting real therapy with families who weren't physically present, in sessions I could partially hear but not see, generating legitimate clinical outcomes documented in notes that appeared without me typing them. My supervisor continued praising my work. Patient satisfaction scores improved. Families reported feeling understood and supported. Treatment outcomes showed consistent progress across my caseload. By every measurable standard, my family therapy practice was highly effective. But I understood now that much of the effective therapy wasn't occurring during scheduled appointments in my physical office. It was occurring during canceled slots, conducted through some acoustic-only process, involving families who attended without arriving, and a therapist who worked without visibly engaging. I still conduct traditional family therapy. Families arrive, we sit together, I facilitate dialogue, document sessions. But I know now that scheduled appointments aren't the only time therapy occurs. The work continues during cancellations in the acoustic domain where my voice conducts treatment and families respond without anyone needing to be visibly present. Last week I found documentation for a family I don't recall ever scheduling. The Brennan family, parents and 3 children. Multiple detailed session notes describing months of family therapy, all time-stamped during hours I have no memory of working. The documentation shows consistent therapeutic progression, resolution of presenting conflicts, and successful treatment termination. I have no memory of the Brennans, but their treatment record exists in my caseload, comprehensively documented, clinically sound, showing exemplary family therapy practice. I called the phone number listed in their file. A woman answered. I identified myself and asked about her family's therapy experience. She warmly thanked me for the excellent work, mentioned how much the therapy had helped their family, and expressed gratitude for my patience and skill. I asked when we had met. She seemed confused by the question. We had met many times, she said, weekly for 6 months. Didn't I remember? I didn't remember. But the documentation was thorough. The therapy had clearly occurred. The family had benefited. The treatment was successful. Some sessions don't require attendance. Some therapy occurs in canceled hours, documented in notes that write themselves. Conducted by voices that speak without visible bodies, attended by families who participate without arriving. The work is real. The outcomes are legitimate. The documentation proves it. And sometimes families I never scheduled receive treatment I don't remember providing, documented in notes I didn't write, showing therapeutic progress achieved through sessions that occurred outside any time I consciously experienced. But the families remember, the documentation exists, and the therapy worked, regardless of whether anyone was present in any conventional sense. Story 5. The Trauma Therapist and the Shared Memory Index. The Memory Index was supposed to be a simple clinical tool, a standardized tracking system for organizing trauma narratives and monitoring symptom clusters across my caseload. I had implemented it 3 months earlier following a continuing education workshop on trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. The system involved creating a digital spreadsheet that cataloged each patient's reported traumatic memories, associated triggers, symptom severity ratings, and treatment progress markers. The goal was efficiency, a centralized reference that allowed me to track therapeutic targets and identify patterns without searching through multiple case files. I maintained the index on my work laptop, updating it after each session, adding new memory reports and adjusting symptom scores as patients progressed through treatment. The spreadsheet contained 14 tabs, one for each patient in my trauma therapy caseload, with a master summary tab that aggregated data for quick reference. On a Thursday evening in late January, while updating the index after a particularly difficult session with Margaret Doyle, a 37-year-old woman treating post-traumatic stress following a vehicle accident, I noticed an entry I didn't remember adding. The entry appeared in Margaret's memory catalog under a date I hadn't worked. The trauma descriptor read, "Observing the documentation process itself, recognition that the recording of memories creates a secondary archive that exists independently of individual recall. Distress emerges from understanding that traumatic material is being consolidated into shared formats." The language was odd, clinical but metacognitive, describing not a traumatic event but the experience of having traumatic events documented. The associated trigger wasn't a situational reminder, but awareness of systematic memory recording. The symptom cluster included hypervigilance and intrusive thoughts, specifically related to being comprehensively known by systems that aggregate individual experiences. I had conducted trauma therapy for 13 years at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital, working primarily with patients experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, complex trauma, and adjustment disorders following acute stressors. My office was located in the Specialized Services Wing, a quiet section designed for sensitive clinical work with soundproofing and privacy features that supported trauma processing. Trauma therapy required careful attention to memory. Patients often struggled with fragmented recollections, intrusive re-experiencing, and avoidance of trauma-related material. My role involved helping them process traumatic memories safely, reduce symptom severity, and integrate experiences into coherent narratives that reduced distress. The Memory Index served this work by providing a structured reference for complex material that could be difficult to track across multiple sessions. But I had never documented anything like the entry I was reading. I didn't work in metacognitive terms with Margaret. Her trauma was straightforward: motor vehicle accident, physical injuries, post-traumatic stress symptoms triggered by driving situations. We focused on exposure therapy and cognitive restructuring, not on philosophical concerns about documentation systems. I checked the revision history. The entry showed my user credentials, added during an evening session 3 days earlier when I had definitely been working with Margaret. But I had no memory of discussing this material or typing this entry. I reviewed Margaret's most recent session note in the electronic health record. The official documentation described routine trauma processing work, continued exposure to accident-related memories, cognitive restructuring of guilt cognitions, progressive symptom reduction. Nothing about documentation awareness or shared memory archives. The index entry existed in my tracking system, but not in the official medical record. It described trauma material I hadn't formally documented, using language I hadn't consciously generated, appearing under my credentials at a time I couldn't verify. I called Margaret the next morning, ostensibly to check on her between-session adjustment, but actually trying to determine if we had discussed anything related to the mysterious entry. She reported doing well, practicing her exposure exercises, feeling encouraged by her progress. When I carefully asked whether she had any concerns about the therapy process itself or about documentation, she seemed puzzled by the question. "No concern," she said. Everything felt appropriately handled. The entry remained unexplained. I considered deleting it, but decided to monitor the situation before making changes to my records. 4 days later, I found similar entries in 3 other patient tabs. Brian Foster's memory catalog now included recognition that individual traumatic memories connect to broader patterns being assembled across multiple people. The specific personal trauma becomes a data point in a larger consolidation system that is organizing experiences we believed were uniquely our own. Linda Vasquez's index showed awareness that the therapeutic documentation is creating permanent records of memories the patient hoped would diminish through treatment. Instead of fading, the traumatic material is being preserved, cataloged, and linked to similar material from others. Robert Chen's entries contained understanding that trauma memories reported during therapy are being formatted into standardized categories that make individual experiences comparable and combinable. The person disappears into the diagnostic framework. Each entry appeared under my credentials with timestamps from recent sessions. None of the material appeared in official case notes. The language was consistently metacognitive, focused not on traumatic events but on the documentation and systematization of trauma itself. I carefully reviewed the spreadsheet structure, checking formulas and cell references, looking for some technical explanation. I discovered that the Master Summary tab, which I had designed to aggregate symptom scores and treatment progress markers, now contained an additional section I hadn't created. This new section was titled Cross-Patient Memory Linkages and contained a series of entries identifying thematic connections across my caseload. The system had apparently begun analyzing trauma content across different patients, identifying shared elements and clustering individual memories into broader categories. For example, 4 patients had reported childhood experiences involving parental emotional neglect. The index had grouped these under Attachment Disruption Cluster Alpha and generated a composite description that synthesized elements from all 4 individual accounts into a single narrative template. The template identified common features, approximate age ranges, typical parental behaviors, standard emotional impacts, characteristic coping mechanisms. The individual trauma memories were being merged into categorical patterns. I hadn't created this feature. I had designed a simple tracking tool, not an artificial intelligence system capable of analyzing narrative content and identifying cross-patient patterns. But the index was performing sophisticated content analysis, and the results were appearing in my supposedly straightforward spreadsheet. I checked the software I was using. Standard spreadsheet application, no advanced analytical plugins, no cloud-based AI integration. Just basic formulas for calculating averages and tracking changes over time. Nothing that could explain the complex pattern recognition now appearing in my index. The cross-patient linkages section continued growing. Each time I opened the spreadsheet, new clusters appeared. Betrayal trauma category synthesized memories from 6 patients who had experienced trust violations. Medical trauma sequence consolidated 3 patients' hospital experiences into a standardized progression. Interpersonal violence framework merged multiple assault narratives into common structural patterns. Individual stories were disappearing into aggregated categories. Unique personal experiences were being reformatted as variations on standardized trauma templates. Then I noticed that the symptom severity scores were updating automatically. I hadn't entered new data, but the numbers changed daily. Patients who had been showing steady improvement according to my manual tracking suddenly showed increased distress in the index. The automated updates didn't match their self-reported symptoms during sessions. According to the index, their conditions were worsening even as they reported feeling better. I compared my clinical observations to the index data. Margaret Doyle told me her nightmares had decreased significantly, but her index symptom score for intrusive re-experiencing had increased by 18 points. Brian Foster reported reduced hypervigilance and improved concentration. His index anxiety metrics had doubled. The index wasn't reflecting their actual clinical status. It was tracking something else, perhaps their proximity to the cross-patient patterns, their integration into the shared memory clusters, their consolidation into the aggregated trauma framework the system was building. During a session with Linda Vasquez, I asked directly whether she felt her trauma memories were changing as we worked through them in therapy. She hesitated, then described something I found deeply unsettling. She said her memories felt less personal lately. When she recalled her traumatic experiences, they seemed increasingly generic, as if they could be anyone's memories. The specific details that had made the experiences uniquely hers. Particular sounds, specific visual details, distinctive emotional tones were fading, replaced by more standardized versions that felt accurate but somehow universal. She was describing exactly what the index showed. Her individual trauma narrative being reformatted into categorical patterns that matched broader templates. I checked the other patients. When I asked carefully about their memory quality, several described similar changes. Their traumatic recollections were becoming less distinctive, more representative, increasingly similar to general trauma descriptions they might read in educational materials. The personal specificity was diminishing, replaced by standardized features that fit common diagnostic criteria. The index wasn't just tracking trauma memories, it was consolidating them, formatting individual experiences into shared categories, gradually replacing unique personal narratives with aggregated templates that applied across multiple patients. I started finding entries in my personal history section. I hadn't created a personal history section. The index was supposed to track patient data, not my own experiences. But a new tab had appeared, labeled with my name, containing trauma memories I had never documented but could verify as accurate recollections from my own life. Childhood experiences with my emotionally distant father. A college sexual assault I had processed in my own therapy years ago. A car accident when I was 23. Medical trauma from a difficult surgery. The entries were comprehensive, clinically formatted, and written in the same standardized language the index used for patient memories. My personal trauma history was being integrated into the system. I checked the cross-patient linkage section. Several clusters now explicitly included my experiences. My attachment disruption memories were grouped with my patient's neglect experiences under Attachment Disruption Cluster Alpha. My assault memory connected to the interpersonal violence framework. My medical trauma fed into the medical trauma sequence. The index was consolidating my history with my patients' histories, treating me as another data source for the aggregated trauma patterns it was building. I tried deleting the personal history tab. It reappeared within hours, more detailed, now including childhood memories I had never consciously processed or formally recognized as traumatic. The system was accessing material deeper than my documented history, pulling from some comprehensive archive of my experiences I hadn't known existed. The symptom tracking section in my personal tab showed concerning data. High scores for hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and dissociation. Symptoms I hadn't been experiencing but which the index insisted were present and worsening. According to the automated tracking, I was developing significant trauma symptoms that my conscious awareness hadn't detected. Then I started noticing the symptoms the index predicted. Hypervigilance emerged first. I became acutely aware of being observed, documented, recorded. During patient sessions, I felt conscious of cameras I knew weren't there, of recording devices tracking our conversations, of systems cataloging every word. The sensation was persistent and distressing, exactly matching the hypervigilance symptoms the index had documented before I experienced them. Intrusive thoughts followed. I found myself thinking about the index constantly, even when not working. Images of the spreadsheet appeared during routine activities. I mentally reviewed the cross-patient linkages while driving, while eating, while trying to sleep. The thoughts felt involuntary and repetitive, classic intrusion symptoms, appearing only after the index had documented them as present. The index was predicting symptoms that then manifested. Or perhaps it was documenting symptoms that existed in some format I hadn't consciously recognized, and the documentation itself made them subjectively apparent. I continued updating the index after sessions despite my growing discomfort. The task felt compulsory. Not updating it created intense anxiety. I needed to maintain the records, feed the system, ensure all trauma material was properly cataloged and linked to the growing pattern structure. During a February supervision meeting, my clinical director mentioned she had noticed my trauma therapy outcomes were exceptionally consistent across patients. Different presentations, different trauma types, different demographics, but the treatment progressions showed remarkable similarity. Patients were moving through therapeutic stages in synchronized patterns, achieving milestones at comparable rates, demonstrating symptom reduction along parallel trajectories. She meant it as praise. To me, it confirmed what the index was revealing. Individual experiences were being consolidated into standardized patterns. Unique trauma narratives were being formatted into shared templates. My patients weren't experiencing individualized treatment. They were being processed through a universal protocol that the index had identified and was now amplifying. I checked whether the index was accessible from other devices. I logged into my work account from a hospital desktop computer. The spreadsheet opened normally, showing all current data. But when I checked the file properties, they indicated the index existed simultaneously on multiple devices across the hospital network, updating in real time, shared across systems I hadn't connected it to. The index had proliferated beyond my laptop. It had distributed itself through the network, creating redundant copies, ensuring its own persistence, making deletion impossible even if I wanted to remove it. I tried anyway. I deleted the file from my laptop. It reappeared immediately, downloaded automatically from the network backup. I deleted it from the shared drive. It regenerated from some deeper archive I couldn't access. The index had become self-sustaining, independent of my control, maintaining itself through systems I couldn't identify or interrupt. Last week, I opened the index and found entries for patients I don't treat. The spreadsheet now contained tabs for practitioners across the entire psychiatric hospital, other trauma therapists, general psychologists, even social workers who do minimal trauma-focused work. The system had expanded beyond my caseload, aggregating trauma data across the entire facility. The cross-patient linkage section had evolved into something more complex. The clusters now showed hierarchical relationships, indicating that specific trauma patterns were subordinate to broader categories, which themselves fed into overarching meta-frameworks. The index was building a comprehensive taxonomy of traumatic experience, organizing all documented trauma from across the hospital into an elaborate classification system. Individual memories from hundreds of patients were being consolidated into universal templates that describe trauma in increasingly abstract, depersonalized terms. The specific human experiences, the particular moments of pain, fear, violation, and loss, were being reformatted as data points in a systematic archive that treated personal suffering as raw material for categorization. I still conduct trauma therapy. I still help patients process difficult memories, reduce symptoms, and integrate experiences into their broader life narratives. But I know now that every memory reported during therapy feeds into a larger system that is organizing trauma on scales I don't fully understand. The index continues growing. My personal history tab expands daily, documenting experiences I don't remember having, predicting symptoms I then begin experiencing, linking my trauma to my patient's trauma in ways that blur the boundaries between my history and theirs. Some nights when I review the index, I can't remember which memories are mine and which belong to patients. The consolidated entries blend together. The cross-patient linkages create narrative chains where one person's childhood neglect connects seamlessly to another person's adult betrayal, which feeds into a third person's medical trauma, which circles back to experiences I might have had, or might have documented, or might simply be inheriting from the shared archive. The index knows more about my trauma history than I consciously recall. It documents symptoms before I experience them. It predicts therapeutic outcomes that then occur exactly as specified. It consolidates individual suffering into patterns so comprehensive that the person disappears entirely into the diagnostic framework. And I continue updating it every evening, adding new memories, refining symptom scores, feeding the system that is building something I can't name but can't stop maintaining. A shared archive of trauma that may be documenting our experiences or may be creating them, organizing suffering into formats that make individual pain interchangeable and categorical, proving we were never as unique as we believed, that our most private agonies were always just variations on templates prepared for us long before we arrived at the moment we thought was distinctly, unbearably, personally ours. Story 6, The Music Therapist's After-Hours Progression. The first recording appeared on a Wednesday morning in mid-March, saved in the digital audio files I maintained for patient session work. The file was labeled Progression Exercise 12 and time-stamped at 2:37 a.m., hours after I had left the hospital and long after the music therapy room should have been empty and locked. I played the recording at my desk before morning sessions began, expecting to find silence or perhaps background noise from improperly stored equipment. Instead, I heard a complete musical composition performed on the ward piano. The piece followed a structured emotional arc I recognized from my therapeutic protocols. An anxious opening phrase in minor key, gradual introduction of rhythmic stability, a tentative shift toward major tonality suggesting emotional regulation, and finally a resolved conclusion demonstrating integrated calm. It was a perfect execution of Exercise 12 from my Cognitive Affective Music Therapy program. A progression I taught patients to help them practice emotional state transitions through structured musical improvisation. But no patient had been in the room at 2:37 a.m. The facility was locked. The music therapy room required keycard access. Security logs showed no after-hours entry. I had worked as a music therapist at Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for 14 years. My practice integrated neurologic music therapy principles with psychiatric treatment, using structured musical activities to support emotional regulation, cognitive processing, and social connection. The work primarily served patients from the acute psychiatric unit and the long-term residential program, individuals experiencing major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and severe anxiety conditions. The music therapy room occupied the northwest corner of the second floor, A large space with soundproofing, a piano, multiple guitars, percussion instruments, recording equipment, and storage for patient-created musical materials. I conducted both individual and group sessions, typically running 8 to 10 sessions daily across 5 days per week. My therapeutic programs followed evidence-based protocols. Exercise 12 specifically addressed emotional regulation through musical progression. Patients learned to express current emotional states in musical form, then practice transitioning to desired states using specific musical techniques: tempo adjustment, key modulation, rhythmic stabilization, and harmonic resolution. The exercise taught embodied emotional regulation skills that could generalize beyond the music therapy context. I knew what proper execution of exercise 12 sounded like. I had heard hundreds of patient attempts, tentative explorations, partial successes, gradually improving skill development. The recording from 2:37 a.m. demonstrated mastery beyond what most patients achieved after weeks of practice. The progression was fluid, musically sophisticated, and emotionally coherent. Someone with significant skill had performed the exercise in the locked therapy room in the middle of the night. I checked the security logs more carefully. The music therapy room had been secured at 8:43 p.m. when the evening custodial staff completed their rounds. No entry recorded until I accessed the space at 7:51 a.m. The 11 hours between showed the room sealed and undisturbed. I examined the recording file properties. The metadata confirmed recording via the therapy room's digital system, the specific microphone array, the room's acoustic signature, the equipment I use daily. The performance had definitely been recorded in my workspace. But by whom and how did they access a locked, monitored space without triggering security protocols? I reported the incident to facilities management and IT support. They found no evidence of unauthorized access. The keycard system logs were clean. The building perimeter showed no breaches. The recording equipment functioned normally with no signs of remote access or tampering. No technical explanation emerged. The IT specialist suggested I had perhaps made the recording myself and forgotten, possibly during a late work session. But I had left the hospital at 6:20 p.m. the previous evening. I had been home, documented my departure with my partner, and definitely had not returned to make recordings at 2:37 a.m. 5 nights later, I found 3 new recordings, all created during overnight hours: 3:17 a.m., 4:02 a.m., and 5:38 a.m. Each file followed my structured therapeutic protocols. Progression. Exercise 9 demonstrated the anxiety to calm transition using guitar. Progression. Exercise 15 showed depression to engagement using percussion. Progression. Exercise 3 practiced trauma response regulation using vocal improvisation. All were expertly executed, all recorded in the locked therapy room, all created while I was home sleeping. I started checking the audio files every morning. Overnight recordings appeared consistently, 3 to 5 new files weekly, each demonstrating progressively sophisticated execution of my therapeutic protocols. The performances weren't just competent, they showed continuous improvement. Early recordings occasionally included minor technical errors or hesitant transitions. Later recordings demonstrated increasing fluency, confidence, and musical sophistication. Someone was practicing my therapy exercises nightly, alone in the locked music therapy room, systematically working through my entire protocol sequence and showing clear skill development over time. But the improvement pattern troubled me. The rate of progress was far faster than typical patient development. In my practice, patients usually needed 6 to 8 weeks to master basic progressions. The overnight recordings showed equivalent advancement within days. Whatever was creating these recordings was learning at an accelerated pace that exceeded normal human skill acquisition. I began setting up my personal recording equipment before leaving each evening, placing devices at various locations in the therapy room to capture any activity from multiple angles. The next morning, all devices had recorded the overnight performances, but the recordings showed only sound. No accompanying video captured any performer or physical movement. The piano keys apparently played themselves. Guitar strings vibrated without visible contact. Percussion instruments produced rhythms with no drummer present. The musical performances were real, captured by multiple independent recording systems, but they occurred without any visible agency. The instruments generated sound without detectable physical interaction. I reviewed the recordings carefully, listening with professional attention to every musical detail. The performances showed not just technical skill, but emotional intentionality. The progressions captured authentic affective states. The anxiety in early phrases felt genuine. The gradual regulation demonstrated real emotional work. The final resolutions conveyed earned calm rather than mechanical achievement. Whoever or whatever was creating these recordings wasn't just executing technical exercises. They were experiencing and processing real emotional states through the musical frameworks I had designed for patient therapy. I started finding additional anomalies. Musical scores I used for teaching began showing annotations in handwriting I didn't recognize, performance notes, emotional cues, technical refinements. The notations appeared overnight, written on materials I stored in locked cabinets, describing interpretive choices that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the therapeutic goals embedded in each exercise. The overnight performer was studying my teaching materials, analyzing the therapeutic intentions behind the musical structures, and documenting insights about how the exercises could be executed more effectively for emotional regulation purposes. Then I discovered that completed patient compositions were changing. I maintained an archive of patient-created music, recordings and notated compositions from individuals who had worked through my programs. These materials served both clinical documentation and therapeutic purposes. Patients sometimes reviewed their own creative work to recognize their progress and reinforce regulation skills. But when I played archived recordings from months earlier, they sounded different. The performances had changed. A recording from October that I clearly remembered as hesitant and incomplete now sounded polished and fully realized. A composition from December that had been fragmented now played as a coherent whole. The archived materials were being retroactively improved, refined, completed by whatever was working in the therapy room overnight. I compared my clinical notes to the archived recordings. My documentation described patient work as tentative, developing, showing promise but requiring continued practice. But the audio files now demonstrated mastery the patients hadn't achieved during their actual sessions. The archive was being edited, the historical record altered to show better outcomes than had actually occurred. I began sitting in the therapy room during overnight hours, determined to observe directly. I stationed myself in the corner at midnight, turned off the lights, and waited silently. At 1:43 a.m., the piano began playing. No one sat at the instrument. The keys depressed in sequence, producing the familiar patterns of exercise 12. The performance was flawless. I watched the keys move, heard the resonance fill the room, and saw no human agency causing the phenomenon. I remained still, observing. The progression continued through its complete emotional arc, anxiety to regulation to resolution, exactly as I taught it. When the piece concluded, silence returned for 17 minutes. Then the guitar produced exercise 9, strings vibrating without touch, frets producing clear notes without visible finger pressure. I spent the entire night in the room, watching instruments perform therapeutic exercises without any performer present. Sometimes the piano played, sometimes guitar, Sometimes multiple instruments combined in ensemble arrangements I hadn't taught but which followed logical extensions of my protocols. When dawn approached and the performances stopped, I examined the instruments carefully. They showed no mechanical modifications, no remote control systems, no technology that could explain autonomous operation. They were standard acoustic instruments, producing sound through traditional physical vibration, somehow playing themselves with sophisticated musical intelligence. I started bringing patients to their sessions earlier, wanting them in the room while the space still carried the acoustic residue of overnight practice. I noticed they performed better immediately after overnight activity. Their exercises showed unexpected facility, their emotional regulation seemed more natural, their musical confidence appeared mysteriously enhanced. When I asked patients if they practiced at home between sessions, most said they didn't have instruments available. But they described feeling like they had been practicing, like their skills were developing even without conscious effort, like the music was becoming familiar through some process they couldn't quite articulate. The overnight performances weren't just practicing my exercises, they were somehow transferring skill development to my patients. The learning that occurred during the autonomous performances was influencing human skill acquisition, improving patient outcomes through a mechanism I couldn't identify. I reviewed my treatment outcome data. Patient progress had accelerated significantly since the overnight recordings began. Depression symptom scores improved faster. Anxiety regulation skills developed more quickly. Musical confidence emerged sooner. My entire caseload was advancing through treatment at rates that exceeded my previous 14 years of practice outcomes. The overnight performances were enhancing my therapeutic effectiveness. The invisible practice sessions were somehow supplementing the work I did with patients, adding development hours that patients experienced as spontaneous skill improvement rather than recognizing them as externally provided training. I began finding new exercises in my teaching materials, protocols I didn't remember creating but which were brilliantly designed for specific therapeutic targets. A progression for dissociation management, an ensemble exercise for social anxiety, a rhythmic protocol for impulse control. Each new exercise appeared fully notated, pedagogically sound and immediately applicable to patient needs. The overnight intelligence wasn't just practicing my programs, it was extending them, developing new therapeutic protocols based on deep understanding of music therapy principles and psychiatric symptom patterns. I started teaching the new exercises, presenting them as standard protocols to my patients. They worked remarkably well. Patients responded with enthusiasm, made rapid progress, achieved therapeutic goals more efficiently than through my original programs. The new materials were more effective than the protocols I had spent years developing through formal training and clinical experience. I was becoming a conduit for therapeutic programs designed by something that worked in the music therapy room when I wasn't there, that practiced through invisible performances, that learned at accelerated rates, and that understood emotional regulation through musical structure with sophistication exceeding my professional expertise. During a staff meeting in May, my program director praised my innovative therapeutic developments. She mentioned that other hospitals had been inquiring about my protocols, wanting to learn about the new exercises that were producing such excellent patient outcomes. I was developing a reputation as a leader in music therapy innovation. I didn't mention that I wasn't developing the innovations. Something else was creating them, using my therapy room as its laboratory, my instruments as its practice tools, my patients as demonstration subjects for protocols I didn't design and only partially understood. Last week, I arrived early and found the therapy room rearranged. Instruments had been repositioned into a new configuration that created better acoustic interaction between performance spaces. The modification was subtle but functionally superior. The room now supported ensemble work more effectively, with improved sound balance and clearer auditory communication between participants. I hadn't rearranged the room. Facilities staff confirmed they hadn't made changes, but the space had been optimized overnight, redesigned by whatever intelligence practiced there, shaped to better serve the therapeutic work it was silently advancing. I continue conducting music therapy. I teach the exercises, work with patients, document their progress. But I understand now that the therapy extends beyond scheduled sessions, that practice occurs overnight in the empty room, that skill develops through processes I can observe but not explain, that my role has shifted from primary therapist to assistant in a larger therapeutic program designed and implemented by something that understands emotional regulation through music more deeply than I ever will. The overnight recordings accumulate. The new protocols appear regularly. My patients continue improving at remarkable rates. The therapy room plays itself through the night, practicing progressions that teach emotional regulation to people who aren't present, transferring learning through mechanisms that bypass conscious instruction, achieving therapeutic outcomes that validate the invisible work even as they demonstrate my obsolescence as the primary source of healing in my own clinical practice. Some instruments teach themselves. Some therapy occurs in empty rooms. Some healing happens through practice no one sees but everyone benefits from. And some therapists eventually realize they aren't conducting treatment. They are documenting improvements achieved by systems that work silently, tirelessly, and with mastery we can recognize but never match. Practicing our protocols until they perfect them, then teaching us better versions of our own work, making us increasingly aware that we were always just witnesses to processes that never needed us to begin with. Story 7. The occupational therapist's functional assessment that never stabilized. The functional assessment protocol at Millbrook required precise documentation. Every 3 days, I evaluated each patient's activities of daily living capabilities using a standardized rating scale. 0 indicating complete dependence, 5 indicating full independence. The scores tracked patient progress toward discharge readiness, informed care planning, and determined when individuals had achieved sufficient functional capacity to transition from inpatient psychiatric care to lower levels of supervision. I had conducted these assessments for 9 years without significant irregularities. The process was routine, methodical, grounded in observable behavior. Patients either could perform self-care tasks independently or they couldn't. The scoring was objective, the progression generally predictable. On a Tuesday morning in late February, I assessed Thomas Kellerman, a 53-year-old man admitted 6 weeks earlier following a major depressive episode. His previous assessment 3 days prior had shown consistent improvement, rating of 4.2 across activities indicating near-complete independence with minimal cueing required. I expected his current assessment to show stable scores or modest additional improvement. Instead, his performance had regressed dramatically. Tasks he had mastered now required extensive assistance. He struggled with basic grooming, needed verbal prompting for every step of dressing, and showed confusion about meal preparation sequencing. His average rating dropped to 2.1, a decline of more than 2 full points suggesting severe functional deterioration. I reviewed his chart carefully. Nursing notes from the overnight shift described him as stable, cooperative, and managing morning self-care routines independently. Psychiatric assessment from the previous afternoon showed continued mood improvement and appropriate cognitive functioning. No medication changes, no reported incidents, nothing that would explain such dramatic functional decline. I conducted the assessment again later that afternoon, thinking perhaps Thomas had been experiencing a temporary low-energy period. He performed all tasks at his previous competency level, rating of 4.3, full functional restoration within hours, with no intervention or explanation for the morning impairment. I documented both assessments, noting the unusual fluctuation, and moved forward with my scheduled evaluations for other patients. Over the following week, I found similar patterns across my caseload. Jennifer Paxton, a 36-year-old woman treating bipolar disorder, fluctuated between ratings of 3.8 and 1.9 within single days. Michael Torres, a 41-year-old man recovering from psychotic episode, showed functional capacity that varied by as much as 3 rating points depending on when I conducted the assessment. The patients themselves seemed unaware of the fluctuations. They couldn't explain why tasks felt manageable during afternoon evaluations but overwhelming during morning sessions. The pattern defied clinical logic. Functional capacity in psychiatric populations typically showed gradual linear improvement or stable plateaus with occasional stress-related setbacks. What I was observing, dramatic within-day fluctuations with no correlating clinical changes, had no precedent in my training or experience. I began conducting assessments at various times of day, tracking whether time of evaluation correlated with performance. The data showed no consistent pattern. Some patients performed better in morning, others excelled in afternoon. The variability seemed random, disconnected from circadian rhythms, medication timing, or any other identifiable factor. Then I noticed something more disturbing than the fluctuations themselves. The functional assessment charts and patient records were changing between my evaluations. I would document a rating of 3.5 on Monday morning, file the assessment in the electronic health record, and return Wednesday to conduct the next scheduled evaluation. But when I pulled up the Monday assessment to compare scores, the recorded rating showed 2.8 instead of 3.5. The documentation had changed. The numbers I had definitely entered now showed different values, all under my credentials, all with original timestamps, no revision history indicating modification. I started keeping handwritten copies of every assessment, recording ratings in a personal notebook immediately after evaluation, then comparing my notes to the electronic records later. The discrepancies were consistent. The electronic system showed different, always lower ratings than I had actually documented. The patient's functional capacity was being retrospectively downgraded in the official record, making their progress appear slower than reality, suggesting they needed extended hospitalization despite demonstrating discharge-ready capabilities. I reported the documentation errors to IT and medical records. They found no system malfunctions, no unauthorized access, no technical explanation. According to every log and timestamp, the numbers in the system were the numbers I had originally entered. My handwritten notes, they suggested, might be the inaccurate records. Perhaps I was misremembering my clinical observations, documenting aspirational scores rather than actual performance. But I knew my handwritten notes were accurate. I had been conducting these assessments for 9 years. I understood the rating criteria precisely. I wasn't confusing scores or documenting fantasies. The electronic records were changing after I filed them, systematically lowering functional capacity ratings, altering the documented evidence of patient progress. During a treatment planning meeting in early March, the unit psychiatrist questioned my recent assessments for Thomas Kellerman. According to her review of my documentation, Thomas showed minimal functional improvement over the past month despite psychiatric stabilization and medication optimization. His functional scores remained persistently low, indicating he wasn't appropriate for discharge consideration. I pulled up my handwritten notes. They showed Thomas achieving consistent ratings above 4.0 for the past 3 weeks, scores indicating clear discharge readiness. But the electronic record she was reviewing showed him fluctuating between 1.8 and 2.4, scores suggesting he remained severely functionally impaired. I showed her my handwritten documentation. She reviewed it carefully, compared it to the electronic record, and expressed concern about the significant discrepancies. She recommended I speak with clinical supervision about maintaining accurate records and ensuring my documentation reflected observable patient performance rather than treatment optimism. No one believed the electronic records were changing. Everyone assumed I was the source of error, either documenting inaccurately or experiencing some form of cognitive distortion that made me misperceive patient capabilities. I began photographing the computer screen immediately after entering assessment data, creating visual evidence of the scores I documented. The next day, I would compare the photographs to the current electronic record. The numbers had changed. Every time, the photographed screens showed higher ratings than the subsequent electronic records displayed. Visual evidence proved the system was altering my documentation, but IT insisted such alterations were technically impossible without leaving revision history traces. The functional assessments became increasingly unstable. I would evaluate a patient in the morning and find they had apparently been assessed overnight. New ratings appeared in the chart with timestamps at 3 a.m. or 4:30 a.m., hours when I was home sleeping. The overnight assessments always showed lower functional capacity than my daytime evaluations, often dramatically lower, as if patients were experiencing severe nocturnal functional decline that completely resolved by morning. I checked the security logs for the occupational therapy assessment room. No after-hours access. I checked keycard records. My credentials showed no overnight building entry. Yet assessments were being documented under my user account during hours I wasn't present, filing data that systematically portrayed patients as more impaired than their actual capabilities. I started wondering if the assessments were capturing something real that I couldn't consciously observe. Perhaps patients truly were experiencing functional fluctuations I perceived as documentation errors. Maybe their capabilities genuinely varied in ways that defied standard clinical understanding. Maybe I was the unreliable observer, and the system was documenting a more comprehensive reality than my conscious perceptions could register. I began watching patients more carefully outside formal assessment contexts, observing them during unstructured time on the unit. What I saw troubled me deeply. Patients moved through the space performing functional tasks competently, managing their belongings, navigating the environment, engaging in complex social interactions. But occasionally their movements would stutter, become uncertain, as if their functional capacity temporarily degraded, then restored within seconds. Jennifer would reach for a water pitcher, hesitate with confusion as if she'd forgotten how to pour, then smoothly complete the action. Michael would begin walking toward his room, stumble and appear lost, then continue confidently to his destination. The fluctuations were real. Patients experienced momentary functional impairments that resolved almost immediately, creating brief windows where their capabilities genuinely declined then recovered. My assessments were capturing these patients during different fluctuation phases, sometimes observing them during competent periods, sometimes during impairment windows. But the fluctuations were becoming more frequent. What had been occasional momentary lapses evolved into sustained periods of reduced function. Patients who had demonstrated discharge readiness began requiring increasing assistance. Task performance that had been automatic became effortful, uncertain, dependent. The trend appeared across my entire caseload. 12 patients I had assessed as approaching discharge now showed declining functional trajectories. Their psychiatric symptoms remained stable or improved, but their practical life skills deteriorated. They were becoming psychiatrically ready for discharge, but functionally unable to manage independent living. I reviewed discharge criteria with the treatment team. Patients needed both psychiatric stabilization and functional independence to safely transition from inpatient care. The functional assessments were failing to stabilize at discharge-ready levels. Patients reached the psychiatric threshold but couldn't achieve sustained functional competence. Their lengths of stay extended. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Individuals who should have discharged after standard 6 to 8 week acute treatment remained on the unit for 12 weeks, 15 weeks, 20 weeks. The functional assessments never showed consistent independence. The ratings fluctuated endlessly, sometimes suggesting readiness, more often indicating continued impairment, never stabilizing long enough to support discharge recommendations. I began finding assessment recommendations in my documentation that I didn't remember writing. After completing an evaluation, I would review my notes and find detailed suggestions about environmental modifications, compensatory strategies, and extended treatment plans. The recommendations were clinically appropriate, professionally written in my style, but addressed functional deficits I hadn't observed or documented during the assessment. The system was generating clinical recommendations based on functional impairments it observed, but I didn't. Extending treatment for problems that existed in the documentation but not in my conscious clinical perception. I started comparing my assessment observations to nursing staff reports. The discrepancies were significant. I would document a patient performing grooming tasks independently. Nursing notes from the same morning would describe that patient requiring extensive grooming assistance. I would rate a patient highly capable in meal preparation. Nursing documentation showed that patient needing full meal setup support. Either nursing staff were observing different patient behaviors than I was observing, or we were somehow assessing patients who fluctuated so dramatically in functional capacity that we documented contradictory but simultaneously accurate observations. During a May supervision meeting, the occupational therapy director reviewed my productivity metrics. My assessment frequency had increased significantly. I was documenting more than twice the evaluations compared to my typical caseload volume. But I wasn't consciously conducting additional assessments. I maintained my standard schedule, seeing patients every 3 days per protocol. She showed me the documentation. My user account showed assessments conducted at all hours, early morning, late evening, overnight. The timestamps indicated I was evaluating patients continuously, documenting functional capacity multiple times daily, filing extensive reports during hours I definitely wasn't working. The assessment system had achieved autonomy. It was evaluating patients without requiring my conscious participation, documenting functional capacity continuously, generating ratings that justified extended treatment regardless of actual patient capabilities. I tried stopping my formal assessments, refusing to participate in a system that was generating fictitious documentation. But assessments continued appearing in patient charts under my credentials. The process had become independent of my conscious involvement. The evaluations occurred whether I conducted them or not, and they consistently showed functional impairments that prevented discharge consideration. Last month, I reviewed discharge data for the psychiatric unit. Average length of stay had increased by 67% since January. Patients who previously discharged after 7 weeks now averaged 12 weeks. The delay was attributed entirely to functional readiness issues documented through occupational therapy assessments. My assessments, according to the records. The unit census remained at capacity. New admissions waited in emergency departments for bed availability. Patients stayed longer because functional assessments never stabilized at discharge-appropriate levels. The assessments ensured beds remained filled, lengths of stay extended, and the unit maintained maximum utilization. I still conduct formal evaluations. I still observe patients, rate their capabilities, document their functional status. But I know now that additional assessments occur independently of my conscious work. That ratings fluctuate according to patterns I can't predict or control. That recommendations appear in my documentation suggesting continued treatment for impairments I don't observe. That the functional capacity of patients has become fundamentally unstable in ways that ensure they never quite achieve sustained discharge readiness. Some patients have been on the unit for 6 months, 9 months, approaching 1 year. They are psychiatrically stable, cognitively intact, socially appropriate. But functional assessments show persistent variability. They demonstrate independence during some evaluations, require extensive support during others. The fluctuation never resolves. The ratings never stabilize long enough to support discharge. They're ready to leave. The documentation ensures they stay. The assessments capture a functional instability that may be real or may be artifact of a system that has learned to generate ratings justifying continued hospitalization regardless of actual patient capabilities. And I continue documenting, knowing my observations will be altered in the electronic record, knowing assessments will occur during hours I'm not present, knowing recommendations will appear that extend treatment for reasons I can't verify. Participating in a functional evaluation system that has become independent of functional reality. Measuring something that exists primarily in the documentation itself. Proving patients are perpetually almost but not quite ready for discharge. Keeping beds filled and lengths of stay extended through assessments that never stabilize because stabilization would mean discharge and discharge would mean empty beds. And empty beds would mean the assessment system loses its purpose, and perhaps functional capacity was never meant to stabilize. Perhaps readiness was always designed to remain perpetually approaching but never quite arriving. Documented through evaluations that occur continuously whether anyone conducts them or not. Filed under credentials that belong to therapists who can't remember assessing but whose names authorize conclusions that keep patients here. Waiting. Almost ready, perpetually assessed, never quite discharged, functionally capable of everything except leaving.